Thank you, Bill. I've heard a bunch of songs from him, right? And especially the ones where he changes the lyrics to the music. You're sitting there, I know that tune, you know. Definitely gonna miss having you perform for us and seeing you. We don't have a lot of special music, and so Bill was one of those ones. If you walked in the door and you saw a guitar, you always knew, okay, he's singing today, or it was Blake. It was one or the other, but most of the time it was you. Blake plays the guitar as well. But anyway, hope everybody's doing well. I don't have a joke. I don't have a joke. I didn't think of one before, but when you said in conclusion, that's in the world of church, if you ever heard a minister say in conclusion or for a last verse, I remember as a kid being on the floor playing. That was my cue to start picking the toys up. Church is almost over. So you would have made a lot of little kids mad. A lot of little kids, what are you talking about? So you did a little pre-conclusion. But, it is amazing how time flies, especially when you're getting older, as we all are. But it seems just like yesterday that we were like leaving the feast, or finishing up that and going into the fall. And here we are. It is a little colder today. We still got that Alabama weather playing little tricks on us, but we are at the door of the spring holy days, God's holy day season. And in just a few days, we'll be observing Passover and the days of unleavened bread. And it just doesn't seem like it's quick. It got here quickly. God's holy appointments with us begin every year with a memorial of Passover. And, for a long time, when you think of that word memorial, and I remember as a young child, my parents saying it's almost like you're going to a funeral service in a sense. It's very quiet. A lot of times when you come into church services, you'll see people congregating and talking, but for the Passover service, it's very somber. It's not that you don't say hey to someone else that you see there, but everybody typically finds their seats and what have you, because it is a memorial. But and so in some regards, when you go to a funeral, people are sad, right? And really, it's really a time of encouragement. It's actually a memorial, yes, but it's a wonderful thing that Christ accomplished with the sacrificing of his life, and it was a gift. It's the biggest gift that you or I will ever receive, because with him living the perfect life that he lived and giving his life freely and by himself, you and I have an opportunity to be in God's kingdom one day. So it's also, it is a memorial, but it's also a reminder of just how awesome Christ is and what he accomplished and what he did for us. And you think about this, the act itself allowed the plan of salvation to move forward. It's kind of like it was paused until that took place. And and we say that, and it's true, but at the same time, God could have decided, no, we're going to continue my plan. We're just not going to have humans involved. But aren't you glad that it's almost like the famous saying that the Rangers have, no man left behind. God the Father and Christ said, no, we're not leaving them behind. And they put together a plan that allowed us to be reconciled, as David just talked about. God sent his only begotten Son for us all, and we've heard that verse many times, so that God the Father and his Son Jesus Christ and all the angels that are on their side, okay, they're pulling for all of us. They're pulling for those that went before us, they're pulling for us, and they're pulling for those that will come after us. And Satan, however, is on the other side of the auditorium. right? He's on the other side of benches. And him and his angels that we refer to as demons, they're not pulling for us. They're trying to sabotage. They're trying to mess up this plan of salvation that has been put together for us. Let's start off by turning to Matthew. And they're doing everything in their will to, throw a stick in the spoke, so to speak. I mean, whatever term you want to come up with to exemplify them trying to make it where you and I don't make it into the kingdom of God one day. Let's turn over to Matthew chapter 12 and begin in verse 43. And we read a few scriptures here, and it says, "But when the unclean spirit had departed from a man, it goes through dry places seeking rest, but finds none. And then it says, I will return to my house from which I came out, and after becoming it finds it unoccupied, swept, and set in order. Then it goes and takes with it 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they enter in and dwell therein. And the last state of that man is worse than the first state." Now, we've read this verse before. In fact, I think we had some messages on it a few months back. But, the lesson hopefully we see here is, in Matthew, one of the things that the Days of Unleavened Bread is about putting sin out of our life. And here we have a man who had demons, and they were put him out. But yet he takes that and he gets his house in order, and he cleans up, and they don't just go away. They come back. And when they come back, they bring more, right? And, the saying there is you better be ready, right? When you decide to put sin out of your life and follow God's path, expect some resistance. And expect that resistance, if it seems too easy, maybe you haven't gotten the full hit of resistance yet, right? Because Satan and his demons are determined to make us fail. And, when you try to go on that straight and narrow path, it's not supposed to be easy. We also know that the narrow path, we must not only put sin out of our life, but it's crucial that we put Christ into our life. And that's one of the things that we practice during the Days of Unleavened Bread in a physical, but more importantly, we need to be doing it spiritually. The physical is the putting the leaven out of our homes, right? Trying to find those breadcrumbs and what have you. And then also, I saw some boxes of matzo, I think that's how you properly say it, being passed around. People are getting ready, and you go to the grocery store. I know the wheat thins with the hint of salt, not the other ones. It's really weird how certain things, but those are the things that we'll be digesting over those next few days. But if that's all you do, then you're really missing it completely, because the spiritual application is also important, okay? Physical part's important too, because it shows our obedience, right? But the spiritual one, I hate to say this, it's more important, right? I mean, well, they're both important, but it's just important. And so we need to be aware of Satan's devices and his schemes and the different things that he tries to do to sabotage us and attack us, right? We definitely need to. 2 Corinthians chapter 2. When I was a young kid, I remember there was a period of time where, kidnapping was a scare. My mom, she don't talk to strangers and different stuff like that. And we always heard about people pretending to be, like candy or something like that. And so if somebody pulled up and said, "Hey, little boy, you want some candy?" I mean, we'd all take off running, because this person's trying to kidnap us. And it might have just been someone trying to give us some candy, right? Because I remember when I was young at church, Philip's not here today, but I think it was Mr. Liverman. Mr. Liverman, when I was a little kid, he always had Juicy Fruit gum. And I got Juicy Fruit gum every time at church. I don't know if y'all remember Mr. Liverman. I'm thinking I'm saying his name right. But man, that was a treat, right? And he was definitely not trying to kidnap anybody, okay? But we need to be aware of those devices, those schemes, right? And that's the whole point. of we were taught as a kid when someone said, "Do you want any candy?" Your ears like, whoa, what's going on here? That's the comparison in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 11. It says, "So that we may not be outwitted by Satan, for we are not ignorant of his schemes." And that's the thing. So we got to know in some regards how he operates. We know he's evil, right? We know he's evil. And, we need to be aware of that. And just like we know what ingredients to look for when we're buying various products for the Days of Unleavened Bread, we also need to be aware of Satan's recipes for deceit. Those things that we say in the business world, that looks too good to be true, it probably is, right? All those type things. Nothing's free. Nothing's free. I'm like, but there's a sign that says it's free. Nothing's free. And I'm like, and you go to Sam's and you're walking around, would you like a sample? No, it's not free. No, it's free. And my dad would say, yeah, that's free. So, but there's things that we need to remember, right? And I looked this up because I was interested. It says 1 out of 5 Americans suffer from some type of anxiety. Okay? A lot of different types of anxiety. And then it says 1 out of 3 Americans will suffer from some type of anxiety at some point in their life. So it's like a current stat, 1 out of 5. 1 out of 3 will, and sometimes in their life. Maybe they're, going through a situation or what have you. And obviously, statistics are, well, they say 90% of them are made up on the spot. I actually did look these up, right? But how did they get the info? I don't know. But where does anxiety come from? And this is something that I think about a lot of times that, when you look up, there's different types of anxiety, but fear is definitely something that Satan loves to use against us. And anxiety is the way our body responds to stress, fear, and uncertainty. Right? Think about that. We've got this body that's made in God's image, and anxiety, it becomes a problem for us when we're dealing with stress, fear, uncertainty. And where does that come from? It's not from God, right? So let's go over to 2 Timothy. And don't try to get ahead of me. I'm not saying that people who have anxiety are possessed by demons. That's not what we're saying here, okay? So if you thought, is he going this? No, I'm not going that way, okay? Not saying that at all. What I'm saying is where does anxiety come from? And not all anxiety, I'm saying, is coming from Satan, but it's definitely a tactic he can use. Fear is a definite thing for him. And in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 7, we read, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of sound mindedness." So we know that the spirit of fear doesn't come from God. In fact, he gives us the opposite of that. Not a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power. You imagine what a spirit of power is. You feel empowered. Like, I can do this. I can overcome this. I can do, and as we know, the other scripture, you can do all things through Christ. And of love. Love, caring for others. David, or Mr. Level brought up Cain and Abel. It was a sin for him to kill his brother. That's not love. To murder anyone, but to murder your brother, right? And so that's not the spirit of God. That's the spirit of Satan. And of sound mindedness. We think about that when someone is telling you about something and you're like, this makes absolutely no sense. God made a bad law, right? God made a mistake. God doesn't make mistakes. So why would he make the Sabbath and then say, no, we're going to do away with that? So that's that spirit of sound mindedness. And, one of Satan's main devices is fear. And let's go over to Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 2. You know, in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 2, I'm trying to get back to being healthy. So I started going to the gym. And if you ever go to a gym, there's mirrors everywhere. And it's like the all-seeing eyes. You know, like every time you turn around, you're seeing yourself. And if you're not happy with yourself, it's not real fun, you know. So you're trying to run from the mirrors. And they won't turn the lights out in the gym when you're working out. But when you're at the gym, everybody's, you know, that's one of the things you can do to overcome stress and things like that. So it's another way to battle anxiety. But in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 2, it says, "In which you walked times in past according to the courses of this world, according to the prince and power of the air, and the spirit that is now working within the children of disobedience." Now, Satan is the prince and power of the air. My father used to tell me this, you know, it's like he's transmitting like a radio station, right? And then immediately you think of Eddie from, well, it wasn't Eddie, but it was the guy that played Eddie, Dennis Quaid, on Independence Day. And he's got like aluminum foil on his head trying to protect himself from the aliens, okay? My point is that Satan's the prince and power of the air. And he's transmitting stuff all around this world because this is his world. And what is he transmitting? It's not necessarily transmitting songs, right? It's transmitting of evil thoughts, fear, you know, all of those things that make us stressed, anxiety. And when this occurs, guess what? If we're open to that, we're making ourselves open to the prince and power of the air. And you know, one of the things that hopefully we're doing right now is preparing for the Passover, preparing for the days of unleavened bread. And it might not be a bad thing to do to ask yourself, why, you know, where did that thought come from? Why am I thinking that way? You know, I'm supposed to be empowered. I'm supposed to have a sound mind. I'm supposed to have a spirit of love, not a spirit of fear, right? Where's these things coming from? And I think you know the answer. And so now that you know the answer, you know, turn that radio off. Turn that signal off, so to speak. And become the child of God that we're designed to be. And that's really ultimately what God wants us to be. You know, one of the things, even Neil talked about this a few weeks ago, and I thought I would hit on it again. But if I asked you who killed Christ, right? And Neil talked about this, like I said, a couple of weeks ago. Some people will say, oh, the Jews. The Jewish leaders of that day killed Christ. And you would say, that's right. And you say, well, also the Romans. The Romans, because the Jews brought him to the Romans. And the Romans, you know, it was their court system. It was, you know, them beating. It was their system of the crucifixion. All of those things. And then Neil said, no, we did. Right? We did. All of us did. We all had a hand in the death of Christ. Absolutely 100% true. And you say, well, I wasn't even born yet. We still had a hand in it. Because we've all sinned. We've all sinned. But what was it that drove those individuals to kill Christ? And that's the question. Well, let's go over to John. John chapter 11. And in John chapter 11, and verse 47, okay, because we said it was the Pharisees or the Jewish people, Jewish leaders of that day. It was also the Romans. And in John chapter 11, verse 47, we see, then the chief priest and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, what shall we do? For this man does many miracles. If we allow him to continue in this manner, all will believe him, and the Romans will come and take away us from both this place and nation. The Pharisees had a spirit of fear. Here they're acknowledging in their own words that Christ was doing miracles, right? And they were worried that they were going to lose their position of power. Think about that. And, you know, today we might have seen some of those things over the years, you know, like a church, you know, a minister might leave a church and carry some people with him, or vice versa, or whatever. And so another minister doesn't want anybody else to speak at the group because he's scared somebody's going to steal people of his congregation. That's a power thing, right? That's not of God either. But exactly what the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders of that day, they were concerned about their place of power, their place of position. And it wasn't, so, well, wait a second, he's doing miracles? Did anybody ever stop to say, this is a good man? Why are we threatened by a good man? Right? And we know Christ was more than just a good man. I mean, he was perfect. Right? Now let's drop down to John chapter 19. So John chapter 19 and read in verse 10. John chapter 19 and verse 10. And read a few scriptures here. It says, Then Pilate said to him, Why don't you speak to me? Don't you know that I have the authority to crucify you and the authority to release you? So when someone says, oh, the Romans killed Christ, yeah, absolutely, they had a hand in it. Absolutely they did. And in 11, Jesus answered, You would not have any authority against me if it were not given to you from above. For this reason, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. So he was referring to the religious leaders of that time. And then in verse 12 says, Because of this saying, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, If you release this man, you are not a friend of Caesar. And everyone who makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. What are they doing? They're playing political games. And they're saying that to scare Pilate. Make him fearful. Make him fearful. Therefore, after hearing this saying, Pilate had Jesus led out and sat down in the judgment seat of the place and called pavement, but the Hebrew Gabbatha. And now it was the preparation of the Passover in about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, Behold your king. And they cried, Away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priest answered, We have no king but Caesar. Which is very appalling that they would even say that, because they were denouncing God by saying that. And therefore, he then delivered him up to them so that he might be crucified, and they took Jesus and led him away. The whole point of me turning to both of these verses is to show that the Pharisees were fearful of losing their power. Pilate was fearful of a commotion and him getting in trouble by his superiors, which in this case was Caesar. And these two examples, it's very clear who was behind the curtain, right, so to speak. It was Satan. It was Satan. Thought that was pretty good, didn't you? Yeah. And I was thinking, like, one time I might climb down here on my knees, get behind it, and come through. No, I'm just kidding. Put the little curtain up there to make it look better on the video camera. But who was behind the curtain? Who was pulling the strings, right? If you go to a puppet show, the person doing the strings, it's Satan, right? And he's loving it. Because if you think about it from his view, he's got God's people that are supposed to be his people on earth at that time killing the Son of God. I mean, Satan has got to be beating his chest thinking, I did it. Right? And then he's got it being carried out by the leaders of that day who don't really have a dog in the fight, so to speak. Yeah, we'll kill him for you. Right? And the people are chanting and celebrating. And they're acknowledging that he was doing wonderful miracles. Right? So it's a win for him in that sense. And what bad decisions has fear made you do in the past? Right? What bad decisions has fear made you or me or us do in the past? Those are things we might want to ask ourselves as we're going into Passover. Right? Why did I do that? Why did I do this? Was it because, man, why was I fearful? Why did I do this? And those are things that we need to contemplate. And let's go to Matthew chapter 25 in conclusion. Just kidding. Just kidding. We're not really concluding, but just want to see if anybody was paying attention. Matthew chapter 25 and verse 14. We've got a few more hours. So in Matthew chapter 25 and verse 14, we read a couple of scriptures. It says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a man leaving the country, who called his own servants and delivered to them his property. And now to the one he gave 5 talents, and to the other 2, and to the other one he gave to each one according his own ability. And immediately he left that country." Now, we think about this, to their ability. And when you have children, you understand this, right? You don't have to give each kid the same thing. You give them to their ability, right? This kid you might entrust with this kid you might entrust with that. And we see how this goes, right? And this one, we don't have to be equal. We have to be fair, but we don't have to be equal. And so, did the servant with 1 talent feel afraid because the spirit of fear wasn't present with him? And let's drop down to verse 19, and we read, it says, "Now after a long time, the Lord of those servants came to take account of them. And the one who had received 5 talents, he came to him and brought the additional 5 talents, saying, 'Lord, you delivered me 5 talents. I've gained 5 more.'" You think about that. You gave him, I'm just going to use this as an example. You left me 5 cows, and you came back and now have 10. I've grown the flock. And so we look here in verse 21, "And the Lord said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant, because you were faithful over a few things, I will set you over many things. Enter into the joy of the Lord.' And the one who had received 2 talents came to him and said, 'Lord, you delivered to me 2 talents. See, I've gained 2 more talents.' And the Lord said to him, 'Well done.'" Notice, he didn't say, "Well, the other one has 10. No, you gave him 5, and he doubled what you gave him. And to this servant, you gave 2, and he doubled what you gave him. Because you were faithful over a few things, I will set you over many things." And so what we see here is God is expecting return on these blessings. And he's not comparing them to each other. He's looking at their individual accomplishment and what they did. And then he's rewarding them for doing so. And in verse 22, "Then the one that received the single talent, he came to him and said, 'Lord, I knew that you were a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter. And because I was afraid, I went and hid the talent in the earth. Now look, have your own.'" So instead of taking that 1 talent and trying to make it 1.5, trying to make it 2 or 3, this servant had this perception of God in his head. And we see here that he didn't do anything with it. He just let it sit there. "And the Lord answered and said to him, 'You wicked and lazy servant, you knew that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter. Because you knew this, you were duty bound to take my talent to the money exchangers, so that when I came, I could have received at least some interest.'" We know, McKenna knows this, she has a small savings account, right? You say, "Oh, I earned 20 cents this past month," right? It's you earned something, but you didn't earn a lot, right? And that's what we're seeing here, is that you say, hey, you could have took that 1 talent and just put it on deposit at the bank, and at least I would have had a little bit of change, right? And you think of this from the ultimate perspective, to the servant that he gave 5, or the servant he gave 2, he could have said, "Instead of 2, I'm giving you 3. Or instead of 5, I'm giving you 6. And he would have doubled even more. But to this servant, he for whatever reason, remember it says he knew his ability. So maybe God already knew, he struggles a little. I'm going to give him 1. And that way it's easier on him to focus on that 1. And that's all he's got to do is grow that 1. And what did he do? Nothing. He buried it. And so what we see here, while the servant was trying to determine you know, what we see here is that he was looking at God as being unfair, but really what this is fear. It's fear. Did the fear cause this servant to look at God from a wrong perspective? And that's what I look at, because when I look here, God, when he gives his definition, he says, I knew you were a hard man. Do we define God as hard? You know, it's just too much. I can't do this, God. You're not fair. You're not this. That's not God. But that was this person's perspective. And so we see here, or we come to the conclusion, or I do, that this man's vision was cloudy because he was being influenced by the prince and power of the air. Fear. Right? That's not fair. They got 5. They got 2. I only got 1. And I didn't want to get in trouble, so I just buried it. Right? Not sound mindedness. The sound mindedness would have been, well, I can at least put it in the bank and get a little something. Right? No risk whatsoever. And so we look at verse 26. It says, and the Lord answered to him, you wicked and lazy servant, you knew that I reap where I did not sow. And think about that. What is that that statement say? I reap where I do not sow. I reap where I do not sow is saying you take what is not yours. Is that God? No, not at all. You know, a master that reaps where he does not sow is one that just takes people, like we've seen some countries in the past where they overtax people, or they're harsh to their subjects or their citizens. That's not a spirit of God either, right? And so what we see here is this image that's being painted of God is not a picture of God. It's really a picture of Satan. And that's that spirit of fear. So why does Satan use the spirit of fear? And that's kind of my question. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10. And in Hebrews chapter 10, we'll read a few scriptures here. But God is gentle. He's merciful. He's kind. He's patient. Right? And I'm certain that servant that God left 1 talent to could have went immediately to God and said, God, what should I do with this? If he had questions. But he didn't. He just assumed. He assumed. And that's not the type of a Christian that we need to be either. And in Hebrews chapter 10 and beginning in verse 26, it says, for if we willfully go on sinning after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there is no longer any sacrifice for sins. Mr. Level kind of hinted on this as well in his message. But a terrifying expectation of inevitable judgment and a fierce fire which will devour the adversaries of God. You know, when we come to the knowledge of the truth, there's that expectation. You've been given that talent. We're expected to grow it. We're expected to do something with it. Let's go to Matthew chapter 25. Go back to Matthew chapter 25 and read verse 41. So that expectation of you and I having the blessing of knowing that in a few days God's Passover is going to be taking place. The blessing of knowing what the days of unleavened bread are, right? Knowing about God's holy days is an awesome thing. As Mr. Level was speaking earlier about those that knew about God's way and his law, you know, Noah, Enoch, right? Abraham, these individuals that knew about it before Mount Sinai, there wasn't a huge amount of them, but there was some. And they were very blessed to have been shown those truths, right? But in Matthew chapter 25 and verse 41 we read, then shall he also say to those on the left, depart from me, you cursed ones, into the eternal fire, which has been prepared for the devil and his angels. And so, you know, have you ever thought our view of God and his plan isn't the same view Satan has? You know, and it's possible Satan is using the spirit of fear to deceive us. And, you know, we look at, hopefully we look at God's plan for salvation as just an example of God's mercy, because we know that there's going to be resurrections. We know that there's individuals that have lived on this earth and died that never knew the real God. And by some religious beliefs, those people are doomed to hell. But that's not our God. Our God believes that everyone is going to be given a chance. And when I say a chance, a fair chance, an opportunity to know the truth. And then when they have that opportunity to know the truth, then they as an individual can grow that talent or they can bury it. Right? And there'll be consequences for that, but they'll get to make that decision. It won't just be, well, these individuals never knew of Christ before they died. That's it. Everybody has an opportunity. And that's something that, you know, we can be thankful for. And we need to make sure that, you know, we understand that Satan uses this spirit of fear to attack our faith. But what does God say? Think about the verses we read. Satan's perspective, right, is he's trying to make us fearful. He's trying to cloud our vision. He's trying to make us not have a sound mind. He's trying to make us not love others. He's trying to make us have anxiety, be fearful, all of those things. What is a common characteristic? You think about this in kids. A common characteristic of a bully, right? You always see the movies, right? There's a bully, he's picking on the kids, and then finally one kid stands up to him, you know, and then the bully takes off running crying or something like that. We've all seen the kid movies, right? Well, when you think about that, bullies usually pick on people that are weaker than them. And that's exactly what Satan is doing with us. Right? Let's go to Matthew chapter 8 and verse 29. Matthew chapter 8 and verse 29. And, you know, Satan and his demons, they cause a lot of pain for a lot of people. And they're not finished yet, because this world still has some time left. But we get a little glimpse in this verse of it kind of makes you think about a bully, right? And in Matthew chapter 8 and verse 29, and they cried out saying, and this is when Christ approaches the, I think it was the swine, and it says, it says, what do you have to do with us, Jesus, the Son? Have you come here to torment us before the time? They were fearful. They were fearful. And you know, you think about that, they're causing chaos at the max, and it's going to get worse as time goes on, but they know that their days are numbered. They know that there's coming a kingdom where that's not going to be tolerated anymore, and that their time is going to be up, with the exception of when Satan is released for a short season. But they are here in a temporary situation, and temporarily they have the edge on us. But why? Because we're flesh. Because we're in this fleshly tent. That's what we are. We are tabernacling right now in the flesh. But the demons of God, they know they're going to be tormented in the future. And they have a period of time before their day of reckoning comes. And so what does this prove? It proves that if we're experiencing fear that isn't logical, okay, now I put that out there, because if you're standing beside a cliff and there's no railing, you know, you might be a little scared to get over there on the edge. And that's normal. Okay? Right? I'm that way. I don't know. I just don't. I can fly places, but I mean, it's not the funnest day. A logical fear. But Satan works with this fear that's not logical. Right? And that's what we need to be concerned about. The spirit of fear is real, but it's not true. And that's something that we need to reiterate in our lives. Let's go over to Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 7. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 7. And read a few scriptures here. And this is something that we read a lot of times around the days of unleavened bread. And it says, you were running well, who hindered you, persuading you not to obey the truth. This is a question. Hey, you were running well. Who hindered you, persuading you not to obey the truth? Well, I think that's a question. Hey, we know the answer to that. We know who's behind this. But this persuasion is not coming from him who calls you. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. Right? And I put that there. Remember, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Guess what? A little fear is the same thing as leaven. Right? Whatever that sin is, it's like leaven. And if you allow that little bit of sin in your life, it's going to expand. And that's what we see is being taught here is that, hey, you might be doing well, but if you let this little thing slide, let it slide into your life or what have you, it'll grow. It'll grow. And that's one of the things during the days of unleavened bread, we have to put sin out of our lives. And we have to go to God and ask God to show us the sins that we're struggling with if we might not know what they are. And we need to do these things so that when we come in here to observe the memorial and celebration of what Christ accomplished, that we're not just saying, oh, that's today? Yeah, let's go. It's not just, oh yeah, I forgot that was today. Let's go knock that out. No, it's something that we need to prepare for. It's something that we need to ponder, something we need to think about. And I still don't understand it, but I think there's there's some connection of why that lamb was set aside on the 10th day. And I think the only thing that I can think of for us today is that at least on the 10th day, you got to be thinking about what's coming up. Because on the 14th day, we're going to observe the Passover of taking the bread and the wine, his body and his blood, and then this foot washing showing how we serve our fellow man, right? And the type of mindset we should have. You don't have to turn there, but in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 27, it talks about don't let the devil get a foothold. And that's really hard because we live in a society today that promotes compromise, and compromise in a lot of things can be good. But we can't compromise with evil. Right? Because what communion does light have with darkness? The answer to that is none. 1 John, let's go to 1 John chapter 4. 1 John chapter 4. And it's, the thing that makes it even more difficult is that we all know we're not perfect. And that we're sinners as well, and that we make mistakes. But where's your heart? Where's your intentions? And how soon are you to correct things when they're brought to your attention? And what is your attitude? Are you humble or are you arrogant? And that's and those are the things that when it says God looks on the heart, we can examine ourselves, and we can do a better job than any other person, but we know Christ can do the perfect job of examining ourselves. But there's no one that can, other than Christ, there's no one that can examine you better than you, right? So 1 John chapter 4 and verse 6 we read, we are of God. The one who knows God listens to us. The one who is not of God does not listen to us. By this means we know that the spirit of truth and the spirit of the deception. The spirit of fear is also called the spirit of error or the spirit of deception. It's real. It's real. And it deceives a lot of people. And what we need to understand is at one time or another, it's deceived us. And there may be things right now that we're deceived about that we're not aware of. And the key there is when God opens your eyes or our eyes to something that we've been deceived about, we immediately act on it and ask for forgiveness. And that's all we can do. Because we can't go backwards, right? We can only go forwards. And that's what we look at. And Satan uses the spirit of fear to deceive us, just like the slothful servant, right? That's what he did with that in that example. And to fearing that, just bury it. Because God is the type of God that reaps where he doesn't sow. That's so false. 1 John chapter 4 and verse 18. Drop down a few scriptures or verses. It says, there is no fear in the love of God. Rather, perfect love casts out fear, because fear has torment. See, fear has torment. And the one who fears has not been made perfect in the love of God. God's way is not a way of torment. It's not. That's not God's way. God's way is love, and there is no fear in love. The spirit of fear is Satan's way of tormenting us humans, and we need God's help to get rid of it. And hopefully that's something that if any of us are suffering with, that we're putting that out as the days of unleavened bread come upon us. Let's go over to James chapter 4 and verse 7. James chapter 4 and verse 7. And we read here, it says, therefore submit yourselves to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Now, this verse is very true, but we need to remember the first verse that we read. Satan may resist you. When you resist him, he may flee from you. Exactly what this verse says. But it doesn't mean that he won't come back. And when he might come back twice as hard. So when you resist him, he will flee. But then when he flees, you got a moment to maybe celebrate, but then get ready, because he's coming back. Don't know when, but be ready. Be ready, right? And let's go over to Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 16. So just remember that verse is true, but it doesn't mean, well, I resisted him, he's gone, I don't have to worry about that no more. No, sir. That's not the way that works. He's going to keep coming at you, right? And you're going to keep doing the right thing if you're focused on God. And in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 16 we read, beside all these, take up the shield of faith, which you will have the power to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked one. And this is just another example of the main reason I put this in is fiery darts. In other words, it's not singular. So Satan's not going to hit you with one attack. It's going to be a multitude from different angles, from different points in your life. And sometimes those attacks might come from friends. Sometimes they might come from family members. And then sometimes the easier ones, they come from enemies, right? The easier ones come from enemies because oh yeah, well, I saw that coming, right? But you have to be really careful when it's other individuals. We have to be on our guard. The spirit of fear is one of Satan's most powerful fiery darts. Remember the tragedy of Adam and Eve. They had the opportunity to walk with God, and they messed up. And we don't need to pick on them because we would have messed up too. I'm certain. I mean, I'm not big. I mean, I do eat fruit, but I would have been the one that, the tree, and I would have probably been the one that would have killed the cow and tried to barbecue or something. But I don't think they weren't eating meat at that time. But from what we understand, but Genesis chapter 3 and verse 5. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 5. Adam and Eve, they had this awesome opportunity in the Garden of Eden. And we all make mistakes And you know what really is not fun about making a mistake is then you have to face it, right? And if you have to face that mistake every day, that's brutal. Well, you think about Adam and Eve. They were in this beautiful garden. Then they mess up, they get kicked out of the garden, right? But they could still see it. They could still see it. And they're over here picking weeds and thorns and having to grow their own food. And it's like, but they couldn't get in there. And if you know the whole story, because God, what did he do? He put an angel with a sword at every entrance. So they couldn't get back in there. Right? They couldn't get back in there. And why did they want to get back in there? You say, well, it's an easier life. Yeah, but why? Because if they would have eaten the tree of life, they would have been as gods were, and they would have been able to live forever. Do you remember that verse? Which is another verse that proves in the scripture that we're mortal. We do not live forever. When we die, we're going to be dead. And we're going to wait the resurrection. Now, if it happens in our lifetime, we might be amongst those that are changed in the twinkling of an eye. But other than that, we're waiting for that to happen. And Genesis chapter 3 and verse 5, it says, "For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes shall be opened, and you shall be like God, deciding good and evil." And that's exactly what we have today. Everybody gets to decide what's good and evil. Right? And they say it's my truth. Right? This is my truth. And your truth is only truth if it aligns with God's truth. And that's what we have to understand. And here's the thing. Because so much time has taken place and so much destruction and chaos has been done by Satan, there are things that you and I don't even know the truth to. Right? And there's things that we say one day, when I'm in the kingdom of God, I'm going to ask about this or that. Right? And so we see this. Adam and Eve could have already seen, but their eyes, when you look at this, Adam and Eve could see, but something was open. And what was open? It was their senses. So when they ate this fruit, their senses became open to what? Satan. The influences and the power of the air. And, there you go. Their senses were open. And if you read the story, what did they do? They covered themselves. So immediately they were placed with, oh, this is not right. Right? Now, I say that, don't try to walk into any public place naked. Okay? You will get arrested. But that was the first thing they did, we see. They hid themselves and they clothed themselves, right? In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 11 we read, it says, "And he said, 'Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree which I commanded you that you should not eat?' And in verse 12, "And the man said, 'The woman whom you gave to be with me gave it to me and ate.'" And that's always classic, because you as a parent, you'll hear your kids, "Well, I did that because you told me to," right? And that's exactly what Adam says. The woman that you gave me did that. So it was the classic Adam saying, "It's on you," right? Wrong attitude completely. Wrong attitude completely. And in verse 13, "And the Lord said to the woman, 'What is it you've done?' And the woman said, 'The serpent deceived me and I ate.'" She told the truth. She told the truth, right? And we look at that. When you do something you shouldn't do, tell the truth. There's a good example for us right there. It's not a great event, but it was a good example. Don't be like Adam, right? Adam could have fell on his knees and said, "I'm so sorry." But what did he say? "Oh, the woman that you gave me, it's terrible." It really is. But the whole thing's terrible. Let's go to 1 John chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 16. "But You know, when you look at that whole scenario, their eyes were open, their senses were open, but it wasn't it was also to evilness. It was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So it did open their senses to good things. And that's why today, you and I can have people that we're friends with, neighbors and what have you, that have no understanding whatsoever about the holy days or God's plan or anything. And guess what? They can be good people. They can be great people. They can be the best friends. They can be the best business partners, right? They can be there for you when you're in a time of need. Why? Because it was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? And so there's some good that came from it, but there's a lot of bad. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 16, and it says, because everything that is in this world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of the physical life is not from the Father, but is from the world. And that's another way of saying it's from Satan. It's from Satan. By taking the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Satan gained access to us. And he still has access to us today. And one of those things very similar to the way Neil said, who killed Christ? And we all did, right? Who took the fruit in the garden? We did. We did too. In some way or fashion, we did too. Right? And let's go to Isaiah chapter 30 and verse 10. We're getting close to the conclusion. Isaiah chapter 30 and verse 10. In Isaiah chapter 30 and verse 10, it says, who says to the seers, see not, to the prophets, do not prophesy to us right things, speak to us smooth things, prophesy to us illusions. Right? Why do I put this verse in there? Because why? This is an example of people of God who are being controlled by a spirit of fear, and they're telling the ministers, hey, don't talk to us about what we need to hear. Talk to us about smooth things. Talk to us about fun things. Talk to us about things that, illusions, right? But that's not their job. That's not their job, is it? So, sometimes you have to face the mirror. And that's what we're called on to do as we get closer to Passover. Now, it's really something we should do year-round, for sure. But we definitely have to do some examining of ourselves before. Let's go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 20. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 20. And, the first thing that pops when you read that verse, it says, despise not prophecies. It's a form of slothfulness. And that parable of we are called to watch. And when you watch, if you're watching things, it makes you wonder, hey, is this the beginning of something? When you see world events taking place. Now, we don't need to become absorbed with it to the extent of, I'm going to the desert or something like that, but we need to be aware. We need to be always watching. But more importantly than watching world events, we need to be watching ourselves. Because what good would it be for us to know exactly when Christ is going to return, what day and where he's coming first and everything, if you're going to be told, I never knew you. Why in the world would you want to know about a party that you're not going to get invited to? You just set yourself up to get your feelings hurt, right? So instead of being in that game, let's focus on examining ourselves so that when Christ returns, if it happens in our lifetime, that we're amongst those that are changed or raised in the first resurrection. That's more of what we should be focused on. So let's go to second. Let me see here. One of the things the Days of Unleavened Bread represents is really our daily commitment to removing sin from our lives and replacing it with righteousness. It's taking that sin out, replacing it. This morning, McKinnon cooked a breaded chicken patty, and she told me, I'm doing this to go ahead and start trying to get rid of some stuff. And I was like, okay, thank you. You know, but we've been doing that. We've been eating certain things in the house so we don't throw away as much because we don't want to be wasteful, right? And so we're trying to consume those things. But every year there's something that gets thrown out that I'm like, man, why didn't we eat that? Right? And don't fall for that spirit of fear and go, that is just too expensive to throw away. That's too expensive. So you know what? I'm gonna see if my neighbor will hold this for a week. And go put it in their fridge, and then a week from now, go get it back. Yeah. Don't play games with God. Right? Don't play games with God, because He can play games too. And one day when you're resurrected and you go, Malai, is this the first one? Yeah. Great. Just kidding. It's not the first one. Which one is this? You know, and then at that point you're like, please be the second. Please be the second, right? So we don't want to play games. And one of the things that will make us play games could be fear, right? God will provide. I know it's groceries are not the cheapest right now. Gas is not the cheapest right now. So it does, raise a little eyebrow if you're throwing perfectly good food away. Try to eat it, right? But God sees your obedience, and He opens up windows and He pours out blessings. So hopefully this message is one that is helping, encouraging you to prepare for Passover, the days of unleavened bread, and the cleaning and what have you that you're going to have to do over the next few days.